What is up, guys? Fado82 coming at you with some footage from the US Rustopia server. Rustopia is a large population vanilla Rust server, and what we mean when we say vanilla Rust is that it's Rust as the developer is intended to be. So there's no special mods or functionality on the server. It's exactly as it's intended to be at that point in time in its development. When we also say early game in Rust, we mean the period after the start of a fresh wipe cycle in the game, which is a very delicate time in the game. It's a very intense and visceral time, and the time that most players, I think, really enjoy getting out there and interacting with one another. You're forced to go out there and gather resources to start your compound, so the large clans, all their members are out gathering resources, they're interacting with other players. It's the most interactive, most engaging time, and the one that I think most Rust players, myself included, really tend to enjoy the most. I believe the new experience system is going to help leverage this primitive early game and kind of make it a little bit longer. So can't wait to see where that goes, but what we're taking a look at here are some small vignettes from early game Rust. Moving into our first scene here, we have a couple nakeds who are holed up in a house after the start of a wipe cycle. They've turned part of the house to stone, so they're starting to move up in the world, but they have to be very careful as they built by a beach here, so it's a very active area. There's a few nakeds out here trying to get through that front door, but notice that they have it airlocked, which means their door doesn't open into their main base, and that's something that you guys really need to make sure you're putting in your base designs. The guy with the skeleton armor here is actually a friendly neighbor, and he didn't mean, I think, to shoot that first homeowner who came out that door because he appears to be helping him out. You always want to have friends because, as you'll notice here, this house is attracting some raiders. There's two raiders moving down into position here with color-coordinated black military watch caps. That is a tactic you guys want to use. If you can have your buddies wear something to differentiate yourself from the enemy, it's always something that you want to put in the practice. This was one of my favorite scenes that I ever recorded. We had a wolf chasing a naked across the map, and he switched targets and went after one of the raiders, gnawing on the raider's penis, and I was really happy to capture that. That's really cool to get with the free cam. So notice here that the raiders are throwing down a fire. This is something that is necessary in that early game because they're not fully clothed here and they're not fully warm from the elements. So they have to stay by the campfire to heal up. And this raider here has that front door locked down with his bow, so he has a really good line of sight on that front door. The guy in the skeleton armor came back to help his neighbor out here, and he's actually taking to the bushes with a crossbow. So he's keeping the raiders busy and trying to keep them off the target of their base here. One of the defenders spawned outside as well, and he's running around out here with a bow. If you can throw a sleeping bag down in the bushes around your base, it allows you to respawn and flank raiders, and that's a strategy you guys always want to incorporate if you can. The raiders are back at the campfire here, and they're regaining their momentum. They're figuring out what their next move is. Again, in early game, you have to really hunt, have food, and utilize those fires to be able to stay warm and heal up. So the raiders, well, they have an advantage here because they are somewhat geared with their hide armor. They still have to be very cautious of every move. The raiders now move down here. Notice that if he gets through this wall, he'll be right in the airlock, so that's the worst wall for him to pick through, but that's fortunate for the homeowners. The neighbor in the skeleton armor has come back here. He's taken to the bushes so you can't see him, but he's using that to his advantage, and he's taken out one of the raiders here. And the other raider heard the door open, so the homeowner opened the door here into the airlock, and the raider rushed in there. He had to switch to his pickaxe as opposed to using his crossbow or his pipe shotgun rather, because in that inner part, it's very difficult to aim. And the homeowner, the defender, was able to take him out with a rock, which is an epic move, and it means a lot, especially in early game Rust, to defend your base, because that's a lot of hard work in the early game to put into the resources with the wood, stone, the code lock, and the doors there. The best part in my mind of this first vignette was a collaboration between the two neighbors. The guy in the bone armor played a pivotal role here, and the raid would have likely gone much differently if he hadn't come over to help out his neighbor. So it's always good to make friends, guys, in Rust, and have neighbors, friendly neighbors if you can. That is something that's going to help you out in the long term. You can see here that the defenders donned the armor of the raiders, so it's been a good day for him. He kept his base, and he's got some new gear. Moving into the second vignette here, we're taking a look at a base out here in the desert, which is still early game in Rust, but it's moving more towards mid-game, as you can see that most of the raiders here have AKs, and they're pretty well geared at that point. They're wearing the roadside armor, and they have metal face masks. The base is built here in the desert, and there are some rocks around it, but not immediately around it, so it's built in a fairly good location where the defenders can get a good vantage point and see what's coming their way. And what's coming their way is something they don't want to see at this stage in the game, because that base isn't that well honeycombed. There's not a lot of walls around it, and if the raiders don't make it into the main base itself, they're probably going to be able to gain access to that quarry out there, and that quarry is working hard. We can see it running heavily out there, so the raiders will likely walk away with at least the yield from the quarry. Watching this footage, what strikes me the most is that the base that's being raided here doesn't have enough windows at the top of the base. Yes, it is early game and they haven't had a chance to build the base the way that maybe they intend for it to be, but it does appear as though they did finish off the base in terms of the height of it because they didn't leave themselves a way to get to the top of it. So it is finished there with the wooden material, and there's no hatchways or ladders to get to the top of the base, so it's safe to say that they intended for that to be probably the top of the base. They need more windows there, which would give them better access to call out the movements of the raiders so they could help to understand the strategy that the raiders are using, but more importantly to focus their fire on the raiders. The raid team, even though it's large, they don't have a lot of space down there to hide from, so if the base had more shooting ports from it, the defenders probably could shred through those raiders, and it didn't appear as though the raiders had a staging base or a raid base or were even throwing down many sleeping bags, so chances are the tide of this raid could be changed very easily if that base had more spots to shoot from. Notice that inside, the defenders are gearing up here. They're intending for it to be a fight, and they're taking all the guns and ammo out to the party here, which they're going to need. And back out here, the raiders are focusing specifically on this wall. You might wonder why they're focusing on that instead of going through doorways. And the reasoning for it is they want to gain access to the corner, which you'll see why in a moment here. But the high exterior wood and stone walls recently received some changes to their values, so they're much easier to get through now. The raiders did initially fire one rocket at that to soften it up, and they're doing the rest with melee tools. They are using whatever they have to their advantage here. Some members are even using swords to help chip through that, which typically aren't used for this type of purpose because they go down in durability very quickly. But the wall has now gone down, and you're going to see why they wanted to gain access to that point. Where the walls sort of come to a pivot there, they're able to get in there and bunny hop up. I thought initially it was to get to the top of the base and go down through the wooden ceilings on top, but it's actually, there's one point in the base here that the defenders rather, did not turn to stone. I don't know if they realized it, but they left that twig. And it's painful to watch here. One of the defenders just ran by that point. He could have shot through that and taken out all those raiders because the raiders can't actually shoot as they're going up the ledge there, up the wall. They did just fire a shot, but it was fired by one of the members on the ground. So if the defender had taken out that twig wall and knew the raiders were coming up there, he could have laid them all out with one clip of AK fire. So that would have been a game changer right there if he had turned that to stone and or taken those raiders out. So now the raiders are inside the base and they're fighting with the defenders. This really struck me, guys, as being something that really shows off how intense Rust is. If you're a Rust player, you know how absolutely adrenaline pumping this is. And this moment in Rust reminded me of something out of the new Rainbow Six game, but it also made me really realize that Rust just does it better than Rainbow Six. It's much more intense, and it's not that it's, I don't want to use the word simplicity, but Rust just gives you more freedom. Less systems and mechanics block what you're doing, and it's just much more apparent that it's a absolutely brutal fight. So the shift here has changed. The raiders are now inside the base, and the defenders are holed up in the bottom of the base here in what looks like their primary loot room. Again, it's early game, so it's not that impressive in terms of a sexy-ass loot room, but they do have sleeping bags down there, and they have chests as well. I'm actually going to stand corrected, guys. I don't think that was their primary loot room. The primary loot room was probably the one that just got compromised on the second floor. So that's a problem because the raiders are now down here with less supplies. The defenders, rather. The raiders are firing some rockets down in there. They know that the defenders are going to make a bit of a last stand in there. So at this point in time, it's going to be go time for the defenders. They really have to make a stand here and hope that it works out in their favor. It's going to be difficult, though. Now the raiders have now breached this area here. They used the smoke of the rockets to their advantage. They came in and just started lighting up the room there and very quickly dispatched the remaining defenders in here. This was a really interesting, intense raid to watch, guys. I really enjoyed it. Hope it translates in the footage. But again, it just was very intense, very quick, and the numbers were evenly matched. I think that this could have really gone bad for the raiders had just a few things gone differently. Now we're moving into our final vignette here, which actually brings us back to the start of the video. At the start of this footage, you guys saw two players running from a supply drop from an airdrop. This is actually where they ended up, at their base after the start of the wipe cycle. I'm not sure if some players followed them back from that supply drop, or if it was just a passing group of players who decided to engage them, but a skirmish has started to light up the night sky here. These players did build close to a road, so they didn't build very far out, so they weren't that well hidden. And that's something, if you guys want to have fun in Rust and always have something going on, build by a monument, build by a rad town, build by a road, high traffic area. You're always going to have something to do in Rust. But as you can see, they're in a very vulnerable position because that top of that base is still twig, which means if the people on the ground can gain access to a point where they can build up, they can actually vault over into that base and start to raid it from a top-down method, which is the typical way that bases are raided. And it wouldn't require much effort to get into the loot room because all they have to do is get through the twig, and then they're going to have to just get through a couple doorways, and then they're in. So to manage against that, what's going to really have to happen here is the defenders have to just stick to defending the top of their base and hoping that they can out-resource the raiders, take enough of them out, and hoping that they'll give up. Typically, that's how it goes in Rust with any raid, large or small. It's a battle of will, a battle of attrition, and oftentimes a resource game. It's who can out-resource the other party, and that will oftentimes change the tides of the raid. As you can see here, some of the raiders decided to cut their losses and hightail it out of here, and they're running across the road, and they're being chased by, I'm not sure if it's the defenders here or just some other players who came into the mix here, but they're taking some shots and trying just to cut their losses and move out. There was a bear that got into the mix here. He took out a naked and he went after one of the raiders here, but the raider was able to dispatch that bear with the AK. The bears have been buffed in the game if you guys aren't aware, so if you see them, watch out and make sure you have enough ammo with you. Back at the base, the defenders are doing just what they need to do, and they're holding that base down. They're not freaking out, they're not leaving the security of their base, and they're making sure that they defend that top of the base, which is, again, the most important and vulnerable spot at this time. As you can see here, it looks like some other players have gotten into the mix here. They're scavenger solo players, if you will, but they were able to capitalize off of the chaos and the darkness, actually take out some of the raiders, and gain some better gear. As day turns tonight, we can see that the defenders here kept their base and also kept what they took from that airdrop at the beginning of the footage. And that's always something that is what Rust is all about, keeping what you're able to build and what you're able to acquire. So it was certainly a win for the defenders here. Alright guys, really hope you enjoyed this free cam primitive early game Rust footage. If you want to see more of this, let me know. As always, had a lot of fun making it. Fado82, peace.